Hi, everybody. This is Darren Wilsey, and today is Saturday, April 25th, 2020. And I'm excited to invite you to our pilot episode of the DNS Music Show. My cousin and I will be chatting tonight about some interesting music trivia. And we've had this idea for some time where we wanted to put together a music podcast. And we thought for this pilot episode, we would discuss the very first concert we ever attended, which happened to be Kiss in 1983 during their Creatures of the Night tour. It was an interesting time to be a Kiss fan, as we'll be discussing tonight. And we'll also be zooming out a little bit and giving you some insight about the music business and the culture at the time. So we're both really excited to be here. I'm going to allow Shane to introduce himself and perhaps say a few things before we get started.
Yes, great. Thank you for having me. My name is Shane Staniford, a lifelong Kiss fan. I was 9 years old in 1983 when my mother and Darren's mother took us to this particular show in upstate New York. This is a pivotal point in my life. I mean, it shaped everything that came after it. And as a Kiss fan, it's a very, like Darren was saying, a very, very interesting part of their history. And looking back at it now and having a chance to do this particular show has given me just an additional appreciation of really how lucky we were to have been able to see Kiss on this particular tour. Not too many people had the chance to do it. It was an extremely, low attended tour, and we'll get into all of that. But as time has gone on, I have like I said, a very deep appreciation, and recently thanked my mother, for for getting those $10 tickets and taking us out there on a snowy winter's night.
Yeah. Well, during the 70s, as anybody watching this will appreciate, Kiss was a phenomenon. They were, in 1977, regarded as probably the biggest rock band in the world. So by the time Shane and I started listening to Kiss or following them, their career was on a different trajectory. I think it's safe to say that when we were 9 or 10 years old, Kiss was basically the band that your older brother liked, but perhaps moved on to other things. Creatures of the Night was recorded during the summer of 1982, and it was actually released on October 13th, 1982. And it was, you can tell by listening to it, it was intended to be a comeback record. Many Kiss fans have made the observation that it seemed as though they had lost their way, musically speaking, and Creatures of the Night was an opportunity for them to get back to their heavy metal or hard rock roots. Did you want to follow up?
Without a doubt. And I think it's something that Kiss fans bring up all the time. Had this album come out 2 years earlier, would this have changed, their status, in the rock community? You're talking about at the time of Back in Black and Judas Priest, British Steel, and a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal coming out. And in 1980, Kiss had put out their most pop album ever with Unmasked, followed up Unmasked with a concept record with Bob Ezrin who produced Pink Floyd's The Wall, and Kiss tried to do their version of it. Looking back at it, it was a disaster, but I can almost understand why, they attempted to do something like that. I mean, The Wall was extremely successful. They had Bob Ezrin, who they'd worked with on Destroyer, which was one of their most, if not the, most outside of Alive, which was a live record, and we'll get into that as well. But from a studio standpoint, their most successful, album to date. So I can almost understand why. But that particular album was heavily classically influenced. The songwriting was subpar, and really sold so poorly that they couldn't even tour. So at this point, Kiss hadn't had a tour in the U.S. since 1979. So we're talking almost 3 or 4 years. which in those days was an extremely long time.
Yeah.
You're talking sometimes 2 cycles per year in terms of they pump out album tour. And those tours were to produce, were to promote the record, where it's kind of the other way around these days.
You mentioned the tour in 1979, and it's interesting to note that even at that point in their career, they had explored different musical influences. Many people regard the Dynasty album, which was released in May 1979, as the disco record. So for the diehards who perhaps were more accustomed to the classic Kiss sound of Destroyer or Rock and Roll Over or Love Gun, some of them perhaps would have abandoned ship even as early as Dynasty.
And some of them did, and the demographic changed greatly, especially on the Dynasty tour, where the band themselves started to see it was more younger children with their parents going to shows. The Dynasty tour and album, because they had one of their biggest international hits ever with it, put them in a pretty good position. However, they were certainly, even in 1979, on a decline in terms of the tour. Was a relative disappointment. I mean, very successful, as compared to future tours in the 80s. But by the standards of the tours prior to 79, there was certainly a pretty big disappointment with some of the numbers in terms of the nights. There were, some multiple nights in certain cities and whatnot. They were unable to it didn't sell quite as well as they expected.
I think one of the interesting things to observe is that when you look at Creatures of the Night and what was happening in 1982, it's such a contrast compared to popular music at the time. Now, I think Creatures of the Night is probably one of the best Kiss albums of all time, certainly in the top 3, in terms of the writing, the performance, the drum sound, the vocals. But it is a contrast when you consider, for example, at the time we went to see Kiss in January of 1983, the #1 song in America was Down Under by Men at Work. Other popular songs included Maneater by Hall & Oates or Dirty Laundry by Don Henley. So when you consider the power and the energy of Creatures of the Night, it's a real contrast to other things that were happening in terms of commercial music.
I remember it vividly. I mean, trying to come back from this show, trying to express my excitement to my classmates. And at the time I went to a very small school. It was K through 12. It's kindergarten through 12 in one building. And the average class size was about 20 kids per class. So, I was in 4th grade. I was 9 years old. And I came back, and we would have certain school gatherings. There was something called the Jump Rope-a-thon, and that had a DJ. And I was desperately trying to get them to play something from Creatures of the Night. I was so excited about this show, coming back, talking. It fell on deaf ears. It was nothing but, Men at Work. I specifically remember how popular Men at Work were that particular month coming back, and they're like, no, we're Kiss. That's Night and Satan service, and satanic. I lived in a very small town. It was it was either considered very passé, or there was a stigma that it was somehow satanic music.
Absolutely, and that's something that perhaps, depending on your age, you may not appreciate, is that in the early 80s, music that today is considered fairly iconic or commercial or relatively benign, for lack of a better description, was very controversial back in the 80s. So if you listen to Kiss, or if you listen to Ozzy Osbourne, or any number of artists that fell into that category of heavy metal, it did come with a stigma. So that's an interesting point.
Oh, it did. And that includes socially. Luckily, for me. I was well-rounded in terms of I played in all different sorts of sports, played on the all-star teams, those sort of things. So that saved me a bit in terms of, because this sort of music, the KISS, the AC/DC, it was for the outcasts in the school. And you were really looked down upon for, for having, wearing a KISS shirt or Ozzy Osbourne. And that was not only from the students, but from the administration.
Absolutely.
And especially in a school such as mine, there was just this very, small group of, you would call them burnouts or hippies or, kids that generally, were a little bit lost.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly identified with them, and because of the music, it certainly was lumped into a little bit of a category. I mean, in my particular case, because of the sports and other activities and certain things, but just picking up on that certainly, culturally, it was that's a whole other part of it.
So one of the things I'll share with the viewers, in case you're not familiar with this, is here, for example, this is one of the singles from Creatures of the Night. It may be the only single, but it's I Love It Loud.
It is the only single, actually.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things when you look at that artwork is that it features Ace Frehley. So as youngins, we were under the impression that Ace Frehley was part of the band at that point, but we later have learned that one of the primary contributors in terms of the writing and guitar behind the scenes recording this record was Vinnie Vincent, who would become an official member for the follow-up record, which was Look It Up. One of the neat things about the concert that we saw on January 18th, 1983 is that it included Vinnie Vincent as part of the band lineup, and he was also in his makeup. So he's one of the few KISS add-ons who actually had a character other than Eric Carr.
Now I'll ask you, I'm not sure I was aware of Vinnie Vincent's existence going into this show. Mm-hmm. I know shortly thereafter, there were popular teen magazines at the time. 16. An ironic 16 magazine, Rockline, Tiger Beat. Oddly enough, even though KISS was certainly a little bit out of the mainstream at that point, the magazines like 16 magazine and some of these other Hit Parader and Circus and some of these hard rock magazines did cover KISS pretty heavily.
Indeed.
And I can't remember if it was right before the show or after the show. Certainly there were pinups and articles and things about Vinnie Vincent. I just can't remember myself if I knew at the time going into this particular show, like, who is this guy?
Well, I distinctly remember, and presumably it would have been right around the time we saw KISS, going into a Rite Aid, checking out 16 magazine or Rockline, and there was a pinup, and it was the first time where it showed the band lineup with Vinnie Vincent in the band, and I remember it had it gave his name, Vinnie the Whiz Vincent.
That's right.
Yeah. So
that's right. So good. That's it's good to know. That answers my question. Because a similar thing happened. It was maybe a year or so later. KISS, for their Animalize tour, had an MTV in concert special, and I was expecting. Now at that time, Vinnie Vincent was no longer in the band. It was a couple years later. Their guitarist is Mark St. John.
Yeah.
And this concert back in those days, obviously pre-YouTube, pre-VCR to a certain degree. This show was on. You maybe luckily found out about it on a TV guide, and you were there, and that was your one and only chance to see it. But when the letters came up, KISS, each was a different member, and the fourth was Bruce Kulick, who I had never heard of, and I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
But anyway, in terms of the Creatures of the Night album.
Well, you bring up a really important point, which is that the dissemination of information was just so different back then. There wasn't any sort of 24/7 news cycle or these, no internet. I mean, basically the magazines were the only way you got any updates about a band or a tour or a new record. And in truth, a lot of what was written was carefully crafted. So for example, one of the reasons you weren't perhaps expecting Vinnie Vincent is because at the time, I think Kiss was trying to give the impression that Ace Frehley was on a hiatus, but he would be back soon.
Yes, I mean they went to great lengths, especially Gene Simmons, to and I also think there was also some financial considerations too in terms of how that was contracted with the record label at the time. And having Ace in the band was very important in terms of that new contract that they had signed a couple of years earlier that could have made it null and void. This is a huge contract that they signed after Dynasty, when Casablanca was acquired by Polygram. That's a whole other story to get into. But I think that was important, and I know Gene really worked tirelessly, behind the scenes, and begging Yanks to stay on. But he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, was having all sorts of drug and alcohol issues. He's even in the press at the time in terms of, you remember the story of him driving up a New York City suburb parkway the wrong way, at a very high speed. That made big Associated Press news. It made my hometown paper news actually. It was a big deal. But he was just there visually for the I Love It Loud video, the promo photos, and then a European promo tour that they did. Promo tour only, just in television shows and stuff, leading up to the Creatures of the Night tour.
Right. Well, that's an important point, which is, I mean, from a fan perspective, Ace Frehley was showing up on the record cover. He's in the I Love It Loud video. I mean, why would you think otherwise? I suppose to a discerning ear, we can listen to the record now and say, okay, the guitar style doesn't necessarily sound like Ace Frehley at all, which is a bit of a giveaway. I'd like to spend a little time talking about the record in detail in terms of the players and how it was recorded. One other interesting aspect of the January 18th show was the opening act, which was Night Ranger, who would go on to become a very successful band during the 1980s. At the time, their first single, Don't Tell Me You Love Me, was becoming a staple of rock radio. And then obviously in 1983, with the release of their Midnight Madness album, they had the mega hit Sister Christian. So we didn't realize at the time what a cool opportunity it was to see these two bands perform together, Night Ranger and Kiss. No one had heard of Night Ranger at the time, at least not in our circles.
Without a doubt. And it also at the time too, we were both heavily, into Ozzy Osbourne, Randy Rhoads. We were both aspiring guitar players, and Randy Rhoads, who had passed away the year before. Brad Gillis was his replacement. And that's another thing that we didn't even, at least for myself, I didn't even put all this together probably until a year or so after the concert.
Exactly.
Knowing exactly who Bruce, who Brad Gillis was, his history, and his short but important, tenure with Ozzy Osbourne, all the while working on this debut album with Night Ranger, which he was very excited about. One note too, Rudy Sarzo, who was a popular bass player at the time, he went on to probably be most noted for his time in Quiet Riot, which was a band in 1983, was the first heavy metal band to reach #1 on the charts with their album Metal Health.
Thanksgiving 1983.
That's right, and it was Rudy's second go around with Quiet Riot. There was a 70s version of Quiet Riot that featured Randy Rhoads, and Rudy was playing with Ozzy at this particular time when Randy passed away in this plane accident.
Yeah, the plane accident happened in Leesburg, Florida on March 19th, 1982. And for guitar or hard rock music fans, Randy Rhoads is a revered icon. He died when he was 25. He recorded 2 records with Ozzy, Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, and both are considered very seminal albums in that genre. And when you think about the pressure of trying to fill those shoes, they would be immense. And Brad Gillis, to his credit, was able to, step in, and he did a very commendable job. One of the things that Rudy Sarzo mentioned is that back then, it was pretty difficult to find people who could play like that. Guitar has evolved and the technique has evolved since then, where it's much more commonplace to find, shredders are a dime a dozen on social media. But in those days, somebody who could, play the solos and the rhythm parts that were featured on Diary of a Madman, that was unusual. It involved a degree of sophistication that was, beyond just the 12-bar blues, for example.
And on very short notice.
Yeah.
I know there was someone else that maybe did substitute a show or two prior to Brad joining the tour.
Yeah.
You would think, with the extent of the tragedy, that there would either be a cancellation or a longer postponement of the tour. But Sharon Osbourne, who's pretty well known here, and Ozzy Osbourne's wife and manager, thought for his sake it was really important to keep his mind on something and to keep that tour rolling, at least according to Rudy Sarzo. But where it applies to Night Ranger in this show too, both Rudy and Brad, who were much younger, had done their stints with Ozzy, were both very excited about their new bands and their new projects and the release of Night Ranger's album, and Rudy going back to Quiet Riot to kind of find some comfort with his friends and musicians his own age. He kind of found the toxic situation over with the Osbournes, and he was looking forward to return. And they turned out to be a pretty brilliant move for both of them, at least in the short term, in terms of the success that they had in '83 and '84, especially with Quiet Riot being the first band to heavy metal band to hit number one.
One memory that I do have that's interesting is that I distinctly remember. It must have been obviously, right after the March 19th, 1982 crash. As it turns out, about a week later, that tour was scheduled for Binghamton, New York, which, by the way, is about an hour from where we grew up. So on the local radio station, I remember hearing several times announcements that concert was canceled. Now, at the time, I didn't appreciate the magnitude of why it was canceled, but I do remember hearing it on WZOZ. Or whatever the radio station was that we listened to when we were kids in upstate New York.
Right, which brings up, we grew up in upstate New York in Oneonta, which is outside of Syracuse. So this is about 4 hours northwest of New York City. But there were a lot of secondary markets up there, mid-sized cities, 60 to 100,000, like Binghamton, Utica, Syracuse. There's something called the New York Thruway. You have the state capital of New York, which is Albany. And it's a thruway that runs kind of across the upper part of the state, where there's several small industrial cities. You have Albany, you have Utica, you have Syracuse, where we attended this show, Rochester, kind of known for Kodak, and then Buffalo. In Niagara Falls, in that area. But Binghamton, and then a lot of these bands at that time, they do not have shows like that up there anymore. But these bands like Kiss that were, on their way out, or even some of the larger bands at the time, played these secondary markets annually. Sometimes even, historically with this particular venue where we saw Kiss, they played there twice in a 3-month period in 1975. But there were these other small cities like Glens Falls where we saw Kiss, very small towns. We're talking 15,000, residents. But they would play that particular circuit.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up the nexus between, the Ozzy Osbourne connection with Night Ranger vis-a-vis the Kiss show. So Brad Gillis recorded a live album with Ozzy called Speak of the Devil, which was released on November 27th, 1982. Now, I remember as a kid, right, when we'd go into a pharmacy called Phase at the mall where we grew up. And Phase, despite being a pharmacy, they had a fairly robust album section where you could go buy albums and 45s. And I guess it would have been in December of 1982. That Speak of the Devil was a big hit. Perhaps because people assumed that maybe Randy Rhoads was part of it, but at the time, it was certainly in the top 10 in terms of album sales. And that was something that was kind of remarkable because as a kid, it has a very distinct record cover that stands out. But to imagine from Brad Gillis's point of view, what it must have been like in November of 1982. On the one hand, he's got, Speak of the Devil coming out, which he performed on, and then also the debut of the first Night Ranger album, which looking back is very seminal. I mean, the musicianship on that record is incredible. Yeah.
It really is. It remains, and this was a bit of a trend for me personally. These bands that opened for Kiss, especially in the 80s, became very near and dear to me. Mm-hmm. Pretty much every tour that I attended, with Night Ranger and Accept and Queensryche and Black and Blue, some of these, lesser known heavy metal bands, but these were such huge occasions for us that whoever this opening act was, I was going to find out everything about them, buy their current, if they had a back catalog, if members were involved with other bands prior to that, I was, on board 100%.
Yeah. And speaking of which, you mentioned opening bands. There was a fairly eclectic group of opening bands for the Creatures of the Night tour. Night Ranger, as it turned out, would play. They were slated for 15 dates, but one was canceled. But several other bands opened up for Kiss during that tour. Most notably, perhaps, is Motley Crue, who were brand new at the time, played about 6 shows on the Creatures of the Night tour. And then another band called the Plasmatics.
Yes, and the Plasmatics featured Wendy O. Williams, who was a bit of a punk rock icon and a bit of a legend in certain circles herself. And some of the members of the Plasmatics, as a result of touring with Kiss, and probably doing the majority of the tour dates, actually, probably opening, if you were to kind of tally up the numbers, doing future work with Kiss as both studio musicians and co-writers on especially the 2 albums later, Animalize, which was their most successful album of the 80s. Mm-hmm. But one thing, kind of jumping back to the album Creatures of the Night itself, I know we were going to, briefly, discuss the album and
sure.
how powerful it was, and in discussing, Ace on the cover, but the style of the playing by the numerous studio musicians that played on this.
Right.
Even the title track, you have Eric Carr, who was the drummer from Kiss at the time. You have the bass player from Toto, and Toto was extremely popular. The guys from Toto were pretty, in addition to having their own band, were kind of part of the second generation of like a wrecking crew out in LA, and helped record a lot of iconic albums and sessions.
I just want to interject.
Sure.
Really quickly, that Kiss recorded Creatures of the Night in Los Angeles at the record plant between August and September of 1982. So continue on.
Right, but it's just a fascinating roster of musicians that were used on it. And even the title track, which was probably one of my, if not my favorite Kiss song of all time. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking it's Ace Frehley, Eric Carr, Paul Stanley, and Gene Simmons, and it's the guy from Toto, and you have Steve Ferris, who was in a band called Mr. Mister, who was also very popular, maybe a one-hit wonder or two, but very popular in the 1980s.
Yeah,
One thing that
I was just going to mention, Mr. Mister had a huge hit in 1985 called Broken Wings.
Right. It was just a couple of years later. And I remember at this time, there was a lot of, there was a lot of drama in the Van Halen camp. And at this time, rumor has it, at least according to Paul Stanley, that Eddie Van Halen was reaching out to Paul Stanley for advice, random calls in the middle of the night. Why did you guys do the solo albums? Strange questions. And he came down to the record plant and listened to the title track, Creatures of the Night, heard the solo by Steve Ferris, and said, that's your guy. That's the guy that, he's amazing. You got to get him. Well, Steve didn't quite have the look, and had no interest in, in being in the band. But it's just, if you're familiar with Mr. Mister and their work, it's just hard to imagine that is his playing one of the best solos of all time in terms of Kiss 80s, in my opinion. It's just an incredible track. And like I said, the combination of musicians on that track itself, and other things about the album that are just, one of the heaviest songs on the album is War Machine, and it was co-written by Bryan Adams, who was writing with Kiss during that time, in 82, 81. Too. He did some work on a previous album called Killers. It wasn't officially released in the U.S., but he was writing with Gene. It's hard to imagine that.
And I think from a production point of view, Creatures of the Night always stands out because of the sound of the drums, the way the drums were produced. I think going forward, they opted for more of that gated reverb sound, but there's something Bonham-like with the drum sounds featured on Creatures of the Night. It just always stands out as an amazing drum album.
It really does. That's what every Kiss fan says about it, is the drum sounds. And how, when Eric Carr had joined the band in 1980, and his first experience in the studio with Kiss was doing this concept album, called The Elder, which was, featured a lot of orchestral and concept songs. It was nothing close to a rock record. So he's like, what am I doing here? But certainly, Creatures of the Night is just a shining moment for him, and it holds up to this day. It happens to be, my favorite Kiss album of all time. I know we recently discussed that, and my 4-year-old sons as well.
Yeah. Well, and another aspect of the album is the guitar sound. I think that it has a very distinct sound that becomes also associated with Lick It Up, which is really that, it's funny to call it modern because the album is over 30 years old. But relatively speaking to what had preceded it, this sort of, it was a new decade and the guitar sounds had changed. And so what we can appreciate now is that the voicings and the guitar sounds have, Vinnie Vincent playing his Jackson Shark guitar. And you can hear it. It definitely sounds different from what Ace Frehley would have played. It's a different style, a different type of chord voicings, vocabulary, and so on. The writing is different.
Yeah, I happened to, interesting that you bring this up. I found a YouTube video the other day where it showcases every Kiss guitarist that ever played in Kiss doing their live version of the Love Gun solo. Starting with Ace Frehley. They even have Mark St. John, who was briefly, he only did 2 or 3 live shows with Kiss. But it has all of the live solos, one right after another. And it was very, very interesting to listen to, because I never even realized it until watching this. But Vinnie Vincent's version of his Love Gun solos or interpretation of it sounds just like Randy Rhoads, as if Randy Rhoads was doing it.
Yeah.
Take a listen to that at some point if you can find it. Maybe we can edit this and put it in a little bit. But it was unbelievable. But those, you know, two Ozzy Osbourne albums too, and that sort of guitar tone and Jackson.
Exactly,
And,
right.
the
tone, the style of playing, it just was, you know, very indicative of the zeitgeist of the 80s and, you know, 80s guitar technique and, you know, more of the, I don't know if there's not a lot of shredding on Creatures of the Night, the way that there's hints of it on Look It Up. I might be wrong. But certainly just the tone is very smooth and distinct. And something, for example, if you just listen to the chords in Danger, it stands out as, again, having this very identifiable sound.
Oh yeah, same with Side B. And you know, with Killer and War Machine too. You know, just Robin Ford also, another, you know, famous blues. I think he's more known as a pretty famous blues guitarist. Did the solo on "I Still Love You," which is an incredible ballad on side 2 of the album. His guitar work is phenomenal.
Yeah,
you know, on that. But all along, until recently, I thought it was Vinnie Vincent.
Yeah.
You know?
So one thing that occurred to me earlier today, when we were kids, Shane and I played in a band together and had the opportunity, I guess it would have been in 1990, went out and had dinner with a guy named Walter O'Brien, who at the time was the manager for Pantera. And Walter shared all sorts of interesting pieces of advice and trivia. But one of the things that he mentioned, it always stood out, is that although heavy metal records may not necessarily make it into the, you know, the top 40, right, or even the top, you know, 100, the shelf life for heavy metal records is vast. It can be, you know, over the span of several decades, and it just, you know, starts accumulating. And when I think about Creatures of the Night, that comparison comes to mind, because although it certainly wasn't, you know, a top 10 best-selling record, over time, right, the appreciation for the album and the material has grown to the point where, again, I believe it's revered by many as one of Kiss's finest studio records.
It is. It is. I follow a lot of Kiss fan forums, podcast shows, polls. You know, I really kind of geek out when it comes to that sort of stuff. And, you know, Creatures of the Night, by far usually, you know, comes in around number 2 or 3. You know,
yeah,
which is hard to believe, but it's you know, stood the test of time very well.
I love everything about that record. I love the cover. From the minute I saw it, it grabs you. And Kiss is so visual, obviously. You know, as kids who, you know, growing up during that time, you're taken in by the combination of the you know, the sound and the visual aspect of it. Let's talk about what it was like seeing Kiss in 1983 at the actual concert. What do you remember about it?
Well, I have some interesting memories from that particular show, but it was so exciting and so overwhelming. First of all, I'm 9 years old. I'm so excited. I couldn't eat a thing the day of the show. Yeah. My mother picked me up at school. We went down and picked you up, and you know, I know we rode out there to Syracuse. You know, one thing that comes up in you know, we have reviews of the show, and certainly we're very familiar with the tour statistics, where I know promoters initially wanted this to be more of a theater tour, you know, versus an arena tour. But Kiss was very ambitious, said we're only doing this in arenas. As a result, the tour, you know, ticket sales were abysmal. Most of the shows were less than 50%.
Yeah.
Capacity. So I think the tour was average somewhere around 48%. So this particular show in the YouTube clip that we might throw up there from a local news station, and you know, a review from the Syracuse Herald from the following day. But even as a 9-year-old who had never been to a concert before, I really remember looking behind where we were and the majority of the arena being empty.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember that as a 9-year-old, and you'll see, you know, in the review and in the YouTube video, though they briefly pan the arena, and you know, you know, it was a couple of people, especially in the upper tier, you know, a couple of people sitting on a lot of seats. I think the final official attendance was around 4,900. And the capacity was 7,900. So it was slightly more than 50%, which was on the higher side for this particular, you know, tour.
Another interesting thing that stood out, and like yourself, I mean, we were just so excited. You know, the notion of seeing Kiss, our favorite band, it was, you know, you just felt like it was, you know, Christmas morning. It was this, you know, incredibly exciting feeling. One of the things that stands out when you look at, you know, Kiss today, live, their live clips and the way they engage with the audience, it was a different vibe during that tour. For example, you know, Paul Stanley, who's famous for his rants in between songs, was a little more vulgar compared to how he is today, which was surprising in a sense that, I mean, I didn't really have any expectations, but I remember my mom looking at me like, you know, plug your ears. With some of the things
right. I mean, you know, future tours, I think that was pretty common in the 80s. You know, their way of trying to be cool, and it was very explicit. For this particular show, it went over my head. I know my mom expressed some guilt. You know, I really shouldn't have taken you to this show. You were too young. You were too young. You know, and one really real interesting memory was there was
all the pot smoke.
Well, the pot smoke, it was a different time. You know, I go to Kiss shows now. It's very family friendly.
Yes.
It's smoke free. I mean, really the only thing you need to worry about is, you know, someone's nachos getting on you or something. It's very family friendly. I would be comfortable bringing a 5-year-old to a show at this particular point in time. But back then it was different. It was a different vibe. There was a slight edge to it.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, and, you know, between not eating, the excitement, the pot smoke, you know, I became physically unwell during the show. And I remember my mom taking me to the bathroom, walking down a hall. She took me into the women's room to kind of collect myself. One thing I remember is the hallway was empty. The bathroom was empty. Imagine this, you're going to a rock concert. My mom is bringing me into the women's bathroom. We're there for 10 minutes. I remember walking back, you know, feeling a little bit better, walking back, hearing I Still Love You playing in the background. So this must have happened later in the set. There was only a few songs after I Still Love You. So I'm thinking I missed, you know, I Still Love You, maybe part of our War Machine, possibly something along those lines. That's another thing I know that my mother felt, you know, horribly guilty, but I was getting this secondhand high at 9 years old. But I don't really think it was anything to do with that. I think it was just the excitement, not being able to eat.
Of course.
And and you know, by that point, you know, a very long day. You know, sitting through, you know, the ride, Night Ranger. The weather wasn't great that night. You know, Syracuse, you get a lot of lake effect snow that time of the year. It's up by the Great Lakes, and you know, the winters are rough there. So that's another memory I have. I remember, you know, pulling into this parking lot, you know, seeing things. It just wasn't. It was a little. It didn't quite even live up to my expectations, and I didn't have any.
Yeah.
You know?
Now, tell me a little bit about the T-shirt that you're wearing.
This T-shirt that I'm wearing is actually, now the merchandise from this tour is very limited. but probably some of the most valuable merchandise in the Kiss that's ever been produced. Actually, it's because of the rarity. Most notably, the tour. I'll get into the T-shirt, but the tour book, which doing a little research, because the tour was canceled early because of the horrible attendance. The tour book wasn't even available until February.
Oh.
I wasn't aware of this. I often said to my mom or thought to myself, "Oh, Shane, you really should have bought the tour book." All future Kiss shows, I bought the tour book. But my mother said I could have one thing, and I bought a hat, which I cannot find, by the way. I wanted to feature it for this show. I've looked high and low. I just can't find it. But this particular T-shirt it's not a reproduction. It's an actual real show. So you have Eric, Gene, Vinnie, and then on the back you have the tank. The
War Machine tank, and the 10th anniversary.
10th anniversary tour, which it says 1974 to 1983. That's an interesting thing on the back there. But I remember the merchandise stand. Maybe they had a pin, book, maybe the T-shirt. Maybe I'm sure this T-shirt was featured.
So if the tour book wasn't available until February, then presumably when we saw them, was there a tour book for sale? Or
no. I thought there was, and I told my mom, hey, if you had stocked up on this particular tour book, you could have put me through college, because it became very valuable.
Oh, okay.
As far as tour books are concerned, it's first of all, it's almost impossible to find one that's in mint condition.
Do you have one?
But I do not have one. It's the only tour book that I do not own from the 80s anyway. Yeah. It is by far that and the Revenge tour that happened in 1992. Those are the two most sought after tour books and pieces of Kiss merchandise, out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know I already mentioned this, but apparently Night Ranger was on, they were slated for 14 tour dates. They played 15 tour dates, but one was canceled. The January 23rd, 1983 show in Providence, Rhode Island was canceled. So they ended up playing 14 shows with Kiss. Their last show, which was on January 30th in Nashville, that one was 90% full. So that had good attendance. But to your point, I actually did the calculations for all of the Night Ranger shows, and on average, they're about 50% full. Yeah, so it seems as though the attendance, relatively speaking, was a bit of a struggle back then.
Yeah, and I know there's a note. I think Paul Stanley, they were playing somewhere in the southern part of the U.S. and he threw a pick, which is very standard for these rock guys, and kind of flew over and just landed, beyond the group of fans that were up front. And that's how empty, some of these shows were. But just even, a week before the show that we went to, we played the 10 or 11,000 up in Canada.
Yeah.
So some of this stuff, and oddly enough, 6 months later to the date, on June 18th of 1983, Kiss played to their biggest audience that they ever played to in their history in Rio de Janeiro, Maracanã Stadium, for some of the final run of makeup shows.
And another interesting thing, exactly. So that all of the tour dates after that were canceled. And what's rather impressive when you think about it is, so that summer, that they scrambled and decided, hey, we've got a record to record. So over the summer of 1983, they recorded "Lick It Up," which I believe came out in September. So they managed.
Right, those albums in the '80s typically came out in September, and it's remarkable considering how things are done these days.
Yeah.
Or the trend, in even the late '80s, '90s. Certain bands, even like Def Leppard at the time, taking 3-4 years between records, and now but back, it's just unbelievable how these albums were pumped out every year, album tour, that we're seeing them. And that's what's interesting about going back and looking at some of these tour dates. And had we had the information or the money or a little bit older, these are such special occasions. But if we had wanted to, all right, well, we missed Kiss in January. Well, they're back playing in September, and then they're playing another show in January. Or these cities like where we saw them in Syracuse, these other neighboring cities, and we talked about the circuit that they were doing in upstate New York or through New England and other parts of the country. These cities are very close in proximity.
Yeah.
We could have gone to 5 Kiss shows in 7 days.
Can you imagine?
No, I can't imagine, because at that point, if you're doing it one time, you think it's never going to happen again.
One of the points that you've made, and I just want to quickly touch upon it, is that the January 18th show was an important one because it's fairly well documented. And in fact, Kiss gave an interview that would become part of a USA special that would broadcast that August.
Yes, they were in New York City that day, recording this show that would later premiere on the USA Network later in the year. But they flew into Syracuse for this particular show. And then resumed the tour in terms of Rochester and some other local other nearby cities on this tour. But yes, it not only in terms of the day of the show with that interview being recorded that went on to be known as something called Kiss Yesterday and Today. Like I said, it was also covered by the local Syracuse television station, which we will have a link for, that gets into the attendance figures and a little bit about Kiss, and that's actually some footage from the show, and then a really great review, not a great review in terms of the review itself, but a very interesting review from the Herald in Syracuse from the next morning. And this became a common occurrence. I've noticed this trend because they played in Binghamton. Binghamton is also a city that was about maybe 45 minutes from where we grew up. Very popular tourist spot for all the bands in the 80s. That's Kiss to the biggest names in rock in the later 80s, Motley Crue, and you name it. They all played in Bon Jovi and all these bands. They all played in Binghamton. But what was always brought up, at least from a local, and I just it was how hideous the sound system was and how beat up it looked. So I don't know if that was just, hey, this is just loud rock music, or if Kiss, they were cutting corners, financially, maybe the companies that they were using in terms of bringing out to do their sound. Did it sound bad? Was the equipment visually beat up? I just happened to notice that reading some reviews from some of those tours, 82, 83, 84.
These are all amazing and interesting points. I think that the last point that we can discuss in wrapping up this episode is that when we were kids, the availability of footage, to see your favorite band was extremely limited. Even MTV, which did exist as of 1983, but it was pretty unusual to see Kiss at that point in their career on MTV. I mean, perhaps maybe once or twice you would have caught the "I Love It Loud" video. But the opportunity to see your favorite band, whether it was live or as part of some sort of televised concert clip or solid gold or whatever it might have been, was a big deal and extremely exciting, and something that we take for granted now because everything is available.
Everything is available, as we all know. And like I said, to think that I had no idea until I did a search just a few years ago, you know, punching in this particular tour date, that this footage existed.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, you can almost find anything.
Yeah.
But more so than any other show outside of the shows in Brazil, this particular show that we saw was really one of the very few, if not the only, is well documented in terms of photos, you know, by local press,
Yeah.
and the fact that the local news covered it, and it was professionally filmed
Mm-hmm.
for, you know, a moment anyway, you know, certain segments of the show, because there are no professional outside of the shows in Brazil. There are zero, you know, professionally filmed shows from this tour. You know, there was a single camera from a show in Canada that does document a full show, but that was, I believe, fan filmed.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I certainly remember the following morning, so that would have been January 19th, seeing a clip on the Syracuse News about the concert. Yeah, and again, that was rather remarkable, the fact that a concert was something that was deemed newsworthy and included in coverage of, you know, what was happening at the time. Yeah, but I also remember it was more of a approach as a novelty, you know, that, you know, Kiss is back, and you know, the band famous for shock rock and glam. Yeah.
That's what was mentioned, and I also love in the you know, both the television clip, and then especially in this newspaper, where it said that the majority of the audience was actually middle-aged adults with young children.
Yeah.
That had a look of bewilderment. Like, you know, you know, you know, did someone specifically see us, you know, or my mother, you know, escorting me out to go to the, you know,
how funny,
out to the men's room to get some, or women's room to get some fresh air at the time.
So with that said, we'll wrap up this episode. And for those who are interested, check out Creatures of the Night. It's certainly one of the seminal records from the Kiss catalog. Both Shane and I are huge fans of that album. And we will continue onward. We appreciate you checking out this episode.
Thanks for having me, and we'll be in touch, and look forward to the next one.
You got it.
Right. Thanks.